The Dawn Flows Home to the Sea, Part 1, by Mikhail Sholokhov, continued. Two of them obtained permission from their officer and went off to bathe in the dawn. But their rest was of short duration, for refugees were soon pouring down to the bridge in an unbroken flood, and the drowsy, shady little spot grew suddenly populous, noisy, and hot, as though the sultriness of the steppe had come down from the Dawnside hills together with the wagons. The commander of the outpost, a tall, lean, non-commissioned officer, stood at the bridge with his hand on the holster of his revolver. He let a good score of wagons pass without hindrance, but then, noticing a young Cossack, perhaps 25 years old, driving along in the line, he curtly ordered him, "Stop." The Cossack frowned and pulled on the reins. "What's your regiment?" the commander demanded, going up to the wagon. "What's that to you?" "What's your regiment, I asked you." "Well?" "I'm from a Ryubezhin company. And who are you?" "Get down." "Who are you? I want to know." "Get down, I tell you." The commander went red in the ears. He unbuttoned the flap of his holster, drew out his revolver, and passed it into his left hand. The young Cossack thrust the reins into his wife's hands and jumped down from the wagon. "Why aren't you with your regiment? Where are you driving to?" the commander questioned him. "I've been ill. I'm going to Bazki now with my family." "Have you got any document showing you had sick leave?" "Where could I get any document? The company was without a doctor." "So you hadn't one?" "Karpenko," he called one of his men. "Take this man along to the school." "Who the devil are you?" the Cossack demanded. "We'll show you who we are. I've got to return to my company. You've got no right to stop me." "We'll send you ourselves. Have you got any weapons?" "A rifle?" "Get it out quick or I'll drill a hole in you. A young Cossack like you and hiding behind your wife's petticoats. Have we got to defend you?" As the commander turned away, he contemptuously called over his shoulder, "Skunk." The Cossack fished his rifle from under a rug. Then, unwilling to kiss his wife in the sight of others, he took her by the hand, muttered something to her, and followed his escort to the school. Once more the wagons crowded into the narrow street rolled thunderously over the bridge. In an hour, the outpost had arrested some 50 deserters. Some of them tried to resist, especially one elderly, long-mustached, fierce-looking little Cossack. When the commander ordered him to get down from his wagon, he struck his horses with his whip. Two of the militiamen seized the animals by the bridles and brought them to a halt on the farther side of the bridge. Without stopping to think twice, the Cossack snatched up a rifle from under a tarpaulin and threw it on his shoulder. "Out of the way," he shouted, "or I'll kill you, curse you." Get down, the militiaman told him. "We've been ordered to shoot anyone who doesn't obey. We'll have you covered in a moment." "You peasants. Yesterday you were killing the Reds, and today you're taking aim at Cossacks. Stinking skins, get away or I'll fire." One of the militiamen jumped onto a front wheel of the wagon and, after a brief struggle, wrested the rifle out of the man's hand. The Cossack bent down like a cat, slipped his hand under the tarpaulin, pulled a saber out of its scabbard, and, kneeling, reached across the side of the wagon, just missing the head of the militiaman as he sprang away. "Timofey, drop it! Timofey! Oh, don't do that! Don't resist! They'll kill you!" his weeping wife cried to the infuriated Cossack. But he rose to his full height in the wagon and swung his steely blue gleaming saber around his head, keeping the militiamen away and cursing evilly. "Stand back or I'll cut you down!" he roared, his face quivering with anger, his eyes going bloodshot. With difficulty they disarmed him, threw him down, and bound him. When they searched the wagon, they found a simple explanation of his stubborn resistance, for in it they came upon a large pitcher of strong homemade vodka. Meantime, the narrow road was dammed with wagons and animals. So closely packed were the vehicles that the bullocks and horses had to be unharnessed, and the wagons were dragged by hand down to the bridge. Frenzied with horseflies, the evilly snorting horses and bullocks snapped the shafts and struggled across to the fences, paying no heed to their master's orders. curses, the whistling of whips, women's lamentations sounded a long time by the bridge. The wagons at the rear, where there was room to move, turned back and climbed up to the highway again to make their way down to the Don at Bazki. The arrested deserters were sent under escort to Bazki, but as they were all armed, the escort could not control them. As soon as they had crossed the bridge, a struggle broke out between the escort and the prisoners. After a little while, the escort returned to the outpost, and the deserters marched themselves off in military order to Vyazhenska. Prokhor arrived at Bazki, opposite Vyazhenska, early in the evening. Thousands of refugee wagons blocked all the streets and side lanes and lined the bank of the Don for nearly 2 miles. Over 1,000 people were scattered through the woods, waiting to be carried to the farther side. Batteries, regimental staffs, and military equipment were being transported by ferry across the river. The infantry were carried in rowboats, dozens of which were dotted over the Don. A seething mass of human beings was crowded around the landing stage. The first detachments of the cavalry covering the retreat began to arrive at midnight, and were to cross as soon as dawn came. But there was no news of the cavalry of the 1st Division, and Prokhor decided to wait in Bazki for his squadron. He left his saddled horse tied to a refugee wagon and went off to look for acquaintances among the crowd. In the distance he noticed Aksinya Astakhova going down to the river, a small bundle pressed against her breast, her warm jacket flung across her shoulders. Her striking beauty attracted the attention of some infantrymen at the riverside, and they called out to her and burst into a lewd and juicy roar of laughter. One tall, flaxen-haired Cossack ventured to put his arms around her from behind and pressed his lips against her swarthy neck, but she pushed the man off roughly, saying something and baring her teeth. The group of soldiers roared, and the Cossack removed his cap, hoarsely pleading, "Just one little kiss." Aksinya hastened her steps and strode on, a contemptuous smile flickering over her lips. Prokhor did not call to her, but looked for other fellow villagers among the crowd. As he slowly passed through the throng, he heard drunken voices and laughter, and the next moment he came upon 3 old men sitting on a horsecloth under a wagon. One of them had a pitcher of homemade vodka between his legs. The merry-making old lads took turns at drinking the vodka from a copper mug made from a shell case, and chewing at some dried fish. The strong smell of the liquor and the salty odor of the fish brought hungry Prokhor to a halt. "Soldier, come and have a drink with us," one of the men invited him. Nothing loath, Prokhor sat down, crossed himself, and smilingly accepted a mug of the liquor from the hospitable old man. "Drink while you're still alive. Here, take a bite at this bream. You needn't wait to be asked, youngster," another of the group said. "The old men are the wise men. You boys have still got to learn from us how to live and how to drink vodka." Prokhor willingly pressed his lips thirstily against the brim of the mug, and without pausing for breath drank its contents to the bottom. "All my living is gone, so why shouldn't I drink?" bellowed the owner of the vodka, a fleshy and healthy old fellow. "I've brought 200 poods of grain with me, but I've had to leave 1,000 behind. I've driven 5 pairs of bullocks as far as this place, but I've got to leave them behind too now, because I can't get them across the river. All that I've scraped together will be lost. So sing up. Come on, friends." His face turned livid, and his eyes filled with tears. "Don't shout, Trofim Ivanitch. If our lives are spared, we shall get rich again," one of the others argued with him. "Why mustn't I shout?" The old Cossack raised his voice still higher, and his face was stained with tears. "My grain will all be lost. My bullocks will die. The Reds will burn down my hut. My son was killed last autumn, so how can I help shouting? Who did I get my farm and possessions together for? In the old days, I'd have 10 shirts rot with sweat on my back during the summer, and now I'm left naked and barefoot. Drink up." During their talk, Prokhor ate a whole bream, drank 7 mugs of vodka, and became so drunk that when he wanted to leave them, he had great difficulty in getting onto his feet. "Soldier, I'll give you some grain for your horse if you want it," the owner of the vodka offered. "I'll take a sackful," Prokhor muttered, indifferent to all around him. The old man poured out a sackful of first-quality oats and helped him to hoist it onto his shoulders. "But bring that sack back. Don't forget, for the love of Christ," he asked Prokhor, embracing him and weeping maudlin tears. "I won't bring it back. I say I won't, and I mean I won't," Prokhor obstinately, senselessly refused. He reeled away from the wagon. The sack on his back drove him on as it swung. To Prokhor it seemed as though he were walking over earth slippery with frost, for his feet went slipping and quivering like those of an unshod horse stepping on ice. After a few uncertain paces he halted, trying to remember whether he had been wearing a cap or not. A horse tied to a wagon smelt the oats, pulled towards the sack, and bit at the corner. The grain ran with a swish through the hole. Finding his burden lighter, Prokhor set off again. He might have succeeded in carrying the rest of the oats to his horse, but a large bull, which he was passing, suddenly lashed out at him with his hoofs. The bull had been tormented by gnats and horseflies, and driven to a frenzy by the heat and continual standing, and would not let anyone approach him. Prokhor, who was not the first victim of the bull's frenzy that day, went flying, struck his head against the hub of a wheel, and fell asleep at once. He awoke about midnight. Above him, leaden-gray clouds were flying westward through the sky. A young moon peered momentarily through a rift, then the sky was enveloped with clouds, and the wind seemed to turn colder. Cavalry was passing quite close to the wagon by which Prokhor was lying. The earth groaned under the trample of innumerable iron-shod hoofs. Sensing the imminence of rain, the animals snorted. Sword scabbards rattled against stirrups. The rusty glow of cigarettes shone out for a moment. The smell of horses' sweat and the acrid scent of leather equipment came to Prokhor's nostrils. Avidly dilating his nostrils at the familiar smell, he raised his heavy head. "What regiment are you, brothers?" he asked. "Cavalry," a voice jestingly replied through the darkness. "Yes, but I asked what regiment?" "Pietlyoras," the same voice answered. "You swine!" Prokhor cursed, and waited for a moment or two, then repeated his question. "What regiment are you, comrades?" "Bokovsky," came the answer. Prokhor tried to get to his feet, but the blood rushed to his head and nausea rose in his throat. He lay down and went off to sleep again. Towards morning, a raw chilliness came up from the river. "He's not dead," he heard a voice above him through his sleep. "He's warm and drunk," another man replied right by Prokhor's ear. "Drag him out of the way. He's dropped down like a carcass. Give him a taste of your lance," the first voice said. With the shaft of his lance, the second man gave the half-conscious Prokhor a painful jab in the ribs, and a pair of hands seized his legs and dragged him to one side. "Unharness those wagons. A fine time to sleep. Here are the Reds right on our tails, and they're sleeping as if they were at home. Push the wagons out of the way. The battery will be passing in a minute. Hurry!" Blocking up the road. "What a lot!" An authoritative voice thundered. The refugees sleeping on and under the wagons began to stir. Prokhor jumped to his feet. He had neither rifle nor sword, and he had lost his right boot since his drunken bout of the previous evening. He was about to search in bewilderment for his things under a wagon, but drivers and gunners from an approaching battery ruthlessly turned the wagon over, together with the chests in it, and in a moment had opened a road for their guns. The drivers ran to their horses. The broad leather traces quivered and tautened. The great wheels of the field guns groaned along the ruts. The hub of an ammunition wagon caught in a wagon shaft and snapped it. "You're deserting the front! Fine soldiers you are, damn you!" the old man who had been so hospitable to Prokhor shouted from the wagon. The battery team went by in silence, hurrying to get across the river. In the early twilight, Prokhor sought long for his rifle and horse, but he found neither. Down by the river he took off his other boot and threw it into the water. Then he wet his head again and again in the endeavor to ease the unbearable pain that gripped it in iron bands. The cavalry began to cross the river at sunrise. The Cossacks drove their horses down to the Don above the point where it turned at a right angle westward. The horses herded together and were unwilling to enter the bitterly cold water. The Cossacks shouted and drove them on with their whips. One raven horse with a broad star on its forehead began to swim, and the others followed it, snorting as they made the water seethe around them. The Cossacks followed them on 6 barges, a man standing on the prow of each barge with a rope lasso ready for any emergency. "Don't get in front of them! Drive them across the current! Don't let it carry them away!" the squadron commander shouted, making his whip whistle in his hand before he brought it down against the leg of his muddy boot. The swift current began to sweep the horses downstream. The raven horse easily outdistanced the others, and was the first to emerge on the sandy shore of the left bank. At that moment the sun peered above the bushy branches of a poplar. A rosy shaft of light fell on the raven horse, and its hair, gleaming with the damp, flashed into a dazzling, somber flame. The horses all reached the farther bank without accident. Cossacks were already waiting for them there, sorting out the mounts as they landed and bridling them. On the other side, men began to send the saddles by boat across the river. After inquiring about his own squadron, Prokhor returned to the refugee wagons. Everywhere the pungent smoke of campfires made of brushwood, dismantled fences, and dried dung was rising in the breeze. The women were getting breakfast. During the night, several thousand more refugees had arrived from the steppe districts on the right bank of the Don. Around the fires arose a hum of voices. Prokhor caught snatches of conversation. "When shall we get a chance to cross? If it's God's will that we're not to get across, I'll pour my grain into the Don rather than let the Reds get it. What we've lived to see, Lord. The Reds have been ordered to kill all the Cossacks from the age of 6 to the very oldest." By a gaily decorated wagon, a gray-haired old man, a village ataman by his looks and authoritative bearing, was haranguing. "I said to him, 'So the people have got to die on the bank of the river? When shall we be able to cross to the other side? The Reds will cut us down to the roots.' And His Excellency said, 'Don't be afraid, Daddy. We shall hold and defend our positions until all the people have crossed. We won't let our wives, children, and fathers suffer.'" The crowd of women and old men surrounding him was listening with the greatest attention. A general medley of shouts arose from them when the old man paused for breath. "Then why has the battery gone across, and the cavalry have arrived? They say Grigor and Aksinya's left the front undefended. Who will defend us now? The soldiers have gone in front and left the people behind. It's every man saving his own skin. We must send elders to the Reds with bread and salt. Maybe they'll have mercy and not punish us." A horseman turned the corner into the street. His rifle was hanging at his saddle bow. A lance was swinging at his side. "Why, that's my Mishka!" an elderly woman cried in delight. She ran to meet the rider, pushing between horses and wagons and jumping over shafts. The rider was seized by the stirrups and brought to a halt. He raised a gray-sealed packet above his head and shouted, "A dispatch for the Chief of Staff. Let me pass." "Mishka, my little son," the elderly woman called agitatedly, the streaky gray strands of her hair falling over her radiant face. Pressing all her body against the horse's side, with a trembling smile, she asked, "Did you come through our village?" "Yes, the Reds are in it now." "Our hut?" "Our hut is left, but Fyodot's has been burned down. Our shed caught too, but the Reds put it out themselves. Fyodot's wife fled and told us their officer said not one of the poor Cossacks' huts was to be burned, but all those of the bourgeoisie." "Well, the Lord be praised. Christ save them!" The woman crossed herself. A stern old man intervened indignantly. "What are you saying, woman? They've burned down your neighbor's hut and you're crying, 'The Lord be praised'? My neighbor can quickly build a new hut, but what could I do if ours was to be burned down?" the woman swiftly retorted. "Fyorit's got a pitcher of gold buried, but I've had to work all my life for others." "Let me go, Mother." The rider leaned down from his saddle. "I've got to hurry with this packet." The woman turned and walked along at the horse's side for a moment, then ran back to the wagon, while the courier shouted, "Make way! I've got a packet for the commander-in-chief. Make way!" The horse pranced and sidestepped, the people reluctantly opened a road, and the rider went with apparent deliberation. But he soon disappeared behind the wagons, behind the backs of the bullocks and horses, and only the lance swung above the enormous crowd as he made his way to the river. Chapter 3. In the course of the next day, the entire insurgent force and the refugees also were transferred to the other side of the river. The last to cross was the Vyshensky regiment of Grigor Melyakov's 1st Division. Until evening, Grigor, with 12 picked squadrons, withstood the pressure of the Reds, and about 5 o'clock, on receiving word from Kudinov that the army and the refugees had all crossed, he gave the order to retreat. In accordance with the insurgents' plans, the companies drawn from the Donside villages were to hold the river bank, each opposite its own village. Where there were extensive gaps between the villages, the staff assigned companies drawn from the Cossacks of the steppe districts, the remainder of these being held behind the line as a reserve. Thus, along the left bank of the Don, the insurgent front stretched for nearly 100 miles, from the farthest villages of the Kazanska district to the mouth of the Khoper. Towards noon, reports began to come in from the various companies, the majority announcing that they were already occupying their respective positions. As soon as they arrived, they hurriedly prepared for a trench war, hastily digging trenches, cutting down and sawing poplars, willows, and oaks, constructing blindages and machine-gun nests. All the empty sacks were commandeered from the refugees, filled with sand, and arranged as breastworks in front of the long line of trenches. By evening, the digging of trenches was everywhere completed. Behind Vyshensky, the 1st and 3rd batteries were masked in pine plantations. For the 8 guns, there were altogether only 5 shells. Cartridges were also well-nigh exhausted. Kudinov dispatched urgent couriers with instructions strictly prohibiting all rifle fire and ordering that each company was to select its 1 or 2 finest marksmen and to supply them with adequate quantities of bullets so that they could pick off the Red machine-gunners and any others who might show themselves in the streets of the right bank villages. All other Cossacks were only to be permitted to fire if the Reds attempted to cross the river. That night, all fires and lights were prohibited in Vyshensky and the meadows surrounding it. All the Donside swam in a lilac mist. The first Red patrols appeared on the farther slopes early the next morning. Soon they were appearing and disappearing on all the hills of the right bank from Ust-Hapiersk to Kazanska. Then the patrols vanished, and until noonday a heavy, deathly silence reigned. But the livid, somber columns of village fires still rose in the south. The clouds, dispersed by the wind, began to gather again, and pallid day-lightning flickered over the ground. A roll of thunder shook the hanging cloud masses, and a lashing rain began to fall. The wind sent it running in dancing waves over the chalky spurs of the Donside hills, over the sunflowers wilting with the heat, over the droughty grain. The rain revived the young dusty leaves, the spring shoots gleamed juicily, the round sunflowers lifted their blackening heads again, and the honey scent of the ripening melons arose from the gardens. The thirsty earth steamed. In the afternoon, the Red patrols again made their appearance on the sentinel mounds that stretch in a chain along the right bank of the Don as far as the Sea of Azov. They rode cautiously down into the villages. After them, the infantry poured down the slopes. Behind the sentinel mounds, whence the sentries of the Poloptsians and the nomad bands had formerly watched for the approach of the enemy, Red batteries were set up. a battery opened fire on Vyazhenska. The first shell burst in the square, and afterwards the little gray clumps of smoke from the explosion of shells and the milky white caps of shrapnel covered the place. Then 3 more batteries opened fire at Vyazhenska and the Cossack trenches along the Don side. Machine guns began to rattle. Transport wagons rolled up to the mounds, and trenches were dug along the slopes of the hills. Now the thunder of cannon was to be heard along the entire front. From the dominating hills, the red batteries raked the opposite bank until late in the evening. The trench-scarred fields, held by the insurgents, were silent all along the line. The Cossack cavalry horses had been concealed in secret river fastnesses, impenetrably overgrown with reeds, sedges, and rushes, where they would not be troubled by the heat. The trees and the lofty osiers hid them perfectly from the eyes of the red observers. Not a soul was to be seen on the green expanses of meadow, save occasionally the tiny figures of refugees, hurrying farther away from the dawn. The red machine gunners sent a few shots after them, and at the heavy whistle of the bullets, the terrified refugees flung themselves to the ground. They lay among the thick grass until dusk, and only then ran off to the forests, without a backward look, hurrying to the north, into the wooded wildernesses, hospitably beckoning with their dense growth of alders and birches. For 2 days, Vyazhenska was subjected to a continuous and intensive artillery bombardment. The inhabitants did not come out of their cellars. Only at night did life appear in the shell-holed streets. The insurgents' general staff came to the opinion that so heavy a bombardment was the prelude to an attempt to cross the river, and they were apprehensive that the Reds would cross opposite Vyazhenska with the object of capturing the place and driving a wedge through the long line of the front, splitting it in 2, and then, by flank attacks, crushing the rising completely. On Kudinov's order, more than 20 machine guns supplied with plentiful reserves of belts were concentrated in Vyazhenska. The battery commanders were ordered to fire their remaining shells only if the Reds were to attempt to cross. The ferry and all the rowboats were brought into a backwater above Vyazhenska, and there were guarded by a strong force. To Grigor Melyakov, the fears of the staff command seemed to have no justification. At a general council of war, he expressed his opinion forcibly. "Do you think there's any possibility of their crossing at Vyazhenska?" he demanded. "Look, on this side the bank is as bare as a tambourine, sandy and smooth, and by the dawn itself there isn't a tree or a bush. On such a bare shore, machine guns would sweep them all off down to the last man. No, they won't try to take Vyazhenska. They're much more likely to attempt to cross either where the river's shallow, where there are fords across sand banks, or else where there's woodland and undergrowth. We must keep a special guard over such spots, especially at night, and must concentrate our reserves there, warning the Cossacks not to make a sound or smell to show where they are." "You say they won't try to take Vyazhenska? Then why are they bombarding it as they are?" one of the others asked. "Go and ask them," Grigor replied. "Are they only firing at Vyazhenska? How about Kazanska and Yavinska? They've got rather more shells than we have. Our own damned artillery has got 5 shells, and those 5 have got oak cases." Kudinov burst into a roar of laughter. "He's hit the bullseye," he remarked. "There's no point in that sort of criticism now," the commander of the 3rd Battery said angrily. "We must discuss the situation seriously." Kudinov frowned and played with his belt. "Melyakov's right in laughing at your artillery," he declared. "You were told again and again not to waste your shells, but to keep them for serious times. But no, you fired at everything that came in sight, even at their wagons, and you've got no right to take offense at criticism. Your position is as laughable as Melyakov says." Grigor's arguments convinced Kudinov, and he resolutely supported the proposal to set a strong guard over all places suitable for crossing, and to concentrate reserve forces close at hand. Grigor's expectation that the Reds would not attempt to cross opposite Vyazhenska, but would choose a more suitable spot, seemed to have confirmation the very next day. In the morning, the commander of the company, stationed opposite Gromok, reported that all night they had heard sounds of activity coming from the other side of the river. Boards had been brought into Gromok on innumerable wagons, and immediately afterwards the noise of saws, the knocking of hammers and axes, had reached the Cossacks' ears across the river. It was evident that the Reds were making something. At first it was supposed that they were building a pontoon bridge, and 2 daring Cossacks went some half-mile farther up the river, undressed, and covering their heads with bushes, quietly floated downstream with the current. They passed very close to the bank and heard Red Army men talking in a machine gun emplacement, but there was nothing in the water, and it was clear the Reds were not building a bridge. As soon as the report arrived of the Reds' preparations, Grigor saddled his horse and rode to the spot. He took a circuitous route for the major part of the road, but for the last 2 miles he decided to ride at a gallop across the open meadow, risking the possibility that the Reds would open fire upon him. He selected a green spur of willows jutting from the Dawnside woodland on the farther side of the meadow, then raised his whip. The blow fell on the horse's croup, and the animal set back its ears and flew like a bird towards the willows. But Grigor had not ridden 100 yards through the meadow when a machine gun began to rattle from the farther side of the river. The bullets whistled past him like marmots. "They've seen me, the devils," he thought, shaking out the reins and bending low, his cheek touching the horse's mane. As though he had guessed Grigor's intention, the Red gunner aimed lower, and the bullets hopped and skipped under the horse's front hoofs, sending the mud spurting up from the earth, still damp with the spring floodwater. Grigor rose in his stirrups and almost lay along the horse's outstretched neck. The green spur of willows rushed towards him with extraordinary speed. When he had covered half the distance, a field gun thundered from the opposite hill. The roar of the explosion made Grigor rock in the saddle. The groaning whistle of the shrapnel had hardly died out of his ears. The reeds, pressed down by the violent disturbance of the air, had not risen again, when the gun thundered a second time. The grinding, oppressing roar seemed to reach its utmost height of intensity, then suddenly stopped for the 100th of a second, and in that 100th of a second a black cloud arose before his eyes. The earth trembled with the shattering blow, and the horse's forelegs fell somewhere into space. Grigor tumbled headlong, striking so forcibly against the ground that his trousers burst at the knees, and the straps broke. The mighty billow of air disturbed by the explosion threw him some distance from his horse. After falling, he crawled a few paces over the grass, his cheek to the ground. Dazed by the fall, he rose to his feet. From above him, clods and sprinkles of earth and grass fell in a black rain. His horse was lying some 20 paces from the shell crater. Its head was motionless, but its hind legs, its sweaty croup, and its tail were quivering with a fine convulsive shiver. The machine gun had lapsed into silence. For some 5 minutes there was not a sound except from the blue kingfishers calling warningly in the reeds. Struggling against his dizziness, Grigor went to his horse. His legs shook and were terribly heavy, and felt as though he had been sitting in an awkward position for a long time. He removed the saddle from the horse, but hardly had he passed into the shell-scarred reeds of the nearest thicket when the machine gun again began to stutter. But he could not hear the flight of the bullets, so evidently they were firing at a new target. He safely reached the company commander's dugout an hour later. "They've stopped hammering now," the man reported. "They'll begin again tonight. You might send us some cartridges. We've only got a couple per man." "Cartridges will be brought this evening. Don't stop watching the other bank for one moment." "We're watching, all right. We're thinking of calling for volunteers to swim across tonight and find out what they're making." "Why didn't you send someone last night?" Grigor demanded. "We did send 2 men, but they were afraid to go into the village. They swam past close to the bank, but they wouldn't go any nearer." "And whom will you get to go now? It's a risky business. Run into one of their outposts and you'd be done for. The Cossacks aren't so very venturesome when they're close to their own villages. During the German war, they were as risky as devils in order to win crosses. But now you have to plead with them to go on sentry duty. And the women are giving us trouble, too. They've come and found their husbands, and they spent last night here in the trenches. And you can't drive them out. I started to chase them off yesterday, and the Cossacks threatened me. You behave a bit quieter, or we'll quickly settle with you, they told me. From the commander's dugout, Grigor went into the trenches. They zigzagged through the forest some 50 yards from the bank of the Don. A growth of acacias and young poplars concealed the yellow mound of the breastworks from the eyes of the enemy. Communication trenches connected the front line with the blindages where the Cossacks rested. Outside the dugouts were gray heaps of dried fish skins, mutton bones, sunflower seeds, melon skins, and other remnants of food, and on the branches newly washed socks, linen drawers, leg rags, women's shifts and skirts were hanging. From the first of the dugouts, a young, sleepy-eyed woman thrust her lank-haired head. She rubbed her eyes and looked around unconcernedly, then disappeared like a marmot into the black gap of the opening. From the next dugout, the sound of quiet singing was coming. A muffled but high, clear soprano voice was mingled with those of the men. Outside the entrance to the third, an elderly, neatly dressed woman was sitting with the grizzled head of a sleeping Cossack resting in her lap. While he was comfortably dozing, she was nimbly searching through his hair and killing the black head lice on a wooden comb, or driving off the flies that settled on her old man's face. But for the angry rattle of a machine gun on the farther side of the Don, and the muffled explosion of shells coming from upstream, one would have thought a band of woodchoppers was resting in the forest, so peaceable was the appearance of the insurgent company. Never before, during 5 years of war, had Grigor seen such an extraordinary front line. Unable to restrain his smiles, he strode past the dugouts, continually coming on women attending to their husbands' needs, mending clothes, washing their linen, preparing food, and cleaning utensils. "You're pretty comfortable here, aren't you?" Grigor said to the company commander as they returned to the dugout. The man took offense at the remark. "We mustn't grumble," he replied. "A bit too comfortable." Grigor frowned. "Get the women out of here at once. Is this place your own yard or a village market? The Reds will be crossing the river and you won't even hear them. Drive the women all out as soon as it's dusk. I'll be coming again tomorrow, and if I see any skirts around, I'll knock your head off first of all." "You're quite right," the man willingly agreed. "I'm against the women being here myself, but what are you to do with the Cossacks? Discipline's gone to pieces. The women wanted to see their husbands. We've been 3 months fighting now." He suddenly turned red and sat down on his pallet in order to hide a woman's apron, and, turning away from Grigor, glanced out of the corners of his eyes to where the smiling black eyes of his own wife were peeping round a sacking curtain which screened one corner of the dugout. Chapter 4. On her arrival in Vyazhenska, Aksinya went to stay with an aunt living on the outskirts not far from the new church. She spent all the first day looking for Grigor, but he had not arrived in Vyazhenska. The whole of the following day bullets were whistling and shells bursting in the streets, and she could not pluck up sufficient resolution to leave the hut. "He told me to come to Vyazhenska, promised we'd be together, and now he's flying the devil knows where," she thought angrily, biting her lips as she lay on a chest in the best room. Her old aunt sat at the window, knitting a stocking and crossing herself after each shot. "Oh, Lord Jesus, it's terrible, terrible. And what are they fighting for? What are they eating one another for?" she whimpered as the window glass scattered with a jangle over the floor of the hut. "Auntie, come away from the window. You may be hit," Aksinya asked her. The old woman stared absurdly at her under her spectacles and replied in an annoyed tone, "Aksinya, you're a fool. Am I an enemy of theirs? Why should they fire at me? You may get killed by accident. They can't see where their bullets are going." "Well, so then they'll kill me. So they don't see who they're shooting at, eh? They're shooting at the Cossacks. The Cossacks are their enemies. I'm old and a widow. What should they want to shoot me for? I expect they know who they're aiming at with their rifles and cannons." At noon of that day, Grigor galloped down the street, bending close over his horse's neck. Aksinya saw him from the window and ran out onto the porch crying, "Grishka!" But Grigor had already disappeared round the corner, leaving the dust to settle gently on the road. It was useless to run after him. She stood on the steps, weeping angry tears. "That wasn't Stepan galloped by? What did you run out for, as if you were mad?" her aunt asked her. "It was one of our villagers," Aksinya replied through her tears. "But what are you crying for?" the inquisitive old woman questioned her. "What do you want to know for? It's not your business." "Oh, so it's not my business. Then it was a lover of yours galloped past. You wouldn't have cried out like that for nothing. I've not lived all these years to no purpose." Towards evening, Prokorzhikov entered the hut. Aksinya was in the best room at the time, and at the sound of Prokhor's voice she ran out, gladly crying, "Prokhor!" "Well, girl, you've given me a fine hunt," he remarked. "I've worn out all my legs looking for you. He's as mad as can be. Firing going on everywhere, and everybody buried alive, and all he says is, 'Find her, or you'll be finding a grave.'" Aksinya seized Prokhor by the shirt sleeve and drew him into the porch. The Dawn Flows Home to the Sea, Part 1, by Mikhail Sholokhov, continued. Aksinya seized Prokhor by the shirt sleeve and drew him into the porch. "Where is he, damn him?" she demanded. Where isn't he? He came back from the front line on his own feet. They'd killed the horse under him. He came back as ill-tempered as a bitch on a chain." "Found her?" he asked. "Where am I to find her?" I answered. "I can't give birth to her." And he said, "A woman can't be lost like a needle." The way he roared at me. He's a wolf in man's form. But come on. In a minute, Aksinya had tied up her little bundle and hurriedly said goodbye to her aunt. "Stepan sent for you?" the old woman asked. "Yes, Auntie." "Well, give him my love and tell him to drop in and see me." Aksinya ran out of the hut without listening to her aunt's parting remarks. She hurried along the street so fast that she began to pant and turned pale. At last Prokhor had even to ask her to go more slowly. "Listen to me," he said. "I used to run after the girls myself when I was a youngster, but I was never in such a hurry as you are. Can't you wait? Is there a fire or what?" In the kitchen of a hut with fast-closed shutters, a candle was burning smokily. Grigor was sitting at the table. He had just finished cleaning his rifle and was rubbing the barrel of his pistol when the door scraped and Aksinya stood on the threshold. Her pale, narrow brow was damp with sweat, and her dilated, angry eyes burned with such frantic passion in her white face that Grigor's heart quivered joyously as he looked at her. "You send for me to come here, and then you yourself vanish," she said, panting heavily. For her, at that moment, as once long since, in the first days of their passion, nothing existed except Grigor. Once more the whole world died when Grigor was absent, and was reborn when he was near her. Heedless of Prokhor, she threw herself towards him, caught up by a savage rapture, and kissed her lover's scrubby cheeks, printing tiny kisses on his nose, his brow, his eyes, his lips, whispering incoherently, weeping and sobbing, "I wore myself out. I'm quite ill, Grishka dearest, my blood, my life." "Well now, you see now? But wait, Aksinya, stop it," Grigor muttered in his embarrassment, turning his face and avoiding Prokhor's eyes. He seated her on the bench, removed the shawl from her head, and stroked her disheveled hair. "You are, he began. "Yes, I know I am. But you—" "No, by God, you're diseased with love." She put her arms round his shoulders, laughed through her tears, and whispered hurriedly, "Well, how could you? You called me. I came on foot, left everything, and then you weren't here. You galloped past, and I ran out and shouted after you, but you'd already turned the corner. They might have killed you, and then I shouldn't have had a last sight of you." She whispered to him tenderly, sweetly, womanly, all the time foolishly stroking his bowed shoulders, incessantly staring into his eyes with her own humble eyes. Something in her gaze was so pitifully exhausted, yet so mortally harsh, like the eyes of a hunted animal, that it was painful and awkward for Grigor to look at her. He dropped his lashes over his eyes, smiled forcedly, and was silent, while the blush deepened and deepened on her cheeks, and her pupils were veiled with a smoky blue haze. Prokhor went outside without a word of farewell. In the porch he spat and trod out the spittle with his foot. "Infatuation and nothing more," he decided harshly as he went down the steps, and demonstratively slammed the gate behind him. For 2 days they lived as in a dream, confusing day and night, oblivious of all around them. Occasionally Grigor awoke after a brief, stupefying sleep, and saw Aksinya's attentive eyes fixed on him in the twilight, as though she were learning his features by heart. She lay, as usual, resting on her elbow, her palm supporting her cheek, and gazed almost unwinkingly. "What are you staring at?" Grigor asked. "I want to look my fill of you. They'll kill you. My heart tells me so." "Well, if it tells you that, stare on," Grigor smiled. On the 3rd day he went out for the first time since her arrival. Kudinov had sent messenger after messenger asking him to come to the staff for a conference, but he had sent them back with the message that the conference could be held without him. Prokhor had obtained a fresh mount for him from the staff, and had ridden by night to the trenches and brought back his saddle. Now, seeing Grigor preparing to go out, Aksinya asked in alarm, "Where are you going?" "I want to ride to Tatarsk to see how our people are defending the village, and to find out where my family is," he replied. "Longing for your children?" With a shiver she wrapped her swarthy shoulders in a shawl. "Yes." "Grigor, don't go, will you?" she pleaded, and her eyes glittered. "Is your family more dear to you than I am? Is it? You're drawn this way and that. Do you think we'll all live together in harmony with Natalia? Is that the way you take me to yourself? Well, go then. But don't come back to me. I won't have you back. I don't want to be treated like that. I don't." Grigor silently went out into the yard and mounted his horse. He reached his village meadowland early in the evening. The road ran through the virgin glade, where every year on St. Peter's Day the Cossacks drank vodka after allotting the meadowland. He passed Alexei's thicket, running like a headland out into the meadows. Long years ago, in this thicket, wolves had attacked a cow belonging to a Tatarsk Cossack named Alexei. Alexei was dead long since. Even his memory was worn away as the inscription wears off a tombstone. His surname was forgotten by his neighbors and kinsmen, but the thicket named after him still stretched its dark green crowns of oaks and elms to heaven. Here the Tatarsk Cossacks were wont to cut down trees for fashioning domestic articles, but each spring vital young shoots arose around the old stumps. There would be a year or two of imperceptible growth, and once more Alexei's thicket would be spreading its green branches, and in autumn would be attired in a golden mantle of frost-nipped oak leaves. Grigor rode under the cool shade of the branches along last year's road, now overgrown. He passed through the virgin glade and made his way up to the black cliff, his mind intoxicated with memories. In his boyhood, close to 3 poplars, he had often hunted wild young ducklings. By the round pond he had sat fishing with a line from dawn to dusk. A little farther on stood a single old cranberry bush. It was visible from the Melyukov yard, and every autumn Grigor had stood on the porch of the hut and delighted in the sight of the bush. From a distance it looked as though consumed by a crimson flame. His dead brother, Pyotr, had been very fond of pies made with the bitter cranberries. With a quiet melancholy in his heart, Grigor looked around the well-known spots. His horse went at a walking pace, lazily driving the gadflies and mosquitoes off with its tail. The grasses gently bowed beneath the breeze, and the meadowland rippled with speckled shadows. He rode to the trenches occupied by the Tatarsk infantry company and sent for his father. Summoned by Christonia, old Panteleimon came hurriedly limping along. "Well, greetings, Chief," the old man called to him as he came up. "Hello, Father. Come to visit us." "I had to. Well, how are our people? Where's Mother and Natalia?" Panteleimon waved his hand and frowned. Tears slipped over his dark brown cheek. "Why, what's the matter? What's happened?" Grigor asked sharply and anxiously. "They haven't crossed the river." "Why not?" "Natalia has been lying in bed these 2 days. Typhus, it looks like, and the old woman wouldn't leave her behind. But don't be alarmed, my son. They're all right." "And the children? Misha, Polya?" "They're there, too. But Dunya came across. She was afraid to stay behind. A single girl, you know. She's only just gone off with Anikushka's wife. I've already been home twice. I crossed the river quietly by night in a boat and visited them. Natalia's very bad, but the children are well, praise be. Natalia's unconscious. She was so hot the blood had caked on her lips." "Why didn't you bring her over to this side?" Grigor exclaimed angrily. The old man grew annoyed, and resentment and reproach sounded in his quivering voice as he answered, "And what were you doing? Couldn't you have come here to get them?" "I've got a division under me. I had to see to the crossing of my division," Grigor fierily protested. "We've heard of your goings-on in Vyashenska. You left your family and didn't trouble. Ah, Grigor, if you're not ready to think of your own people, you should think more of God. I didn't cross the river here, or do you think I wouldn't have brought them? My platoon was in Yelanska, and by the time we reached here, the Reds had entered Tatarsk. What I was doing in Vyashenska is nothing to do with you, and don't you—" Grigor's voice was hoarse and muffled. "I didn't mean anything." The old man took alarm and stared dissatisfiedly at the Cossacks crowded a little way off. "But talk more quietly. They can hear you over there." He dropped his own voice to a whisper. "You're not a little child. You ought to know better. But don't worry about your family. Natalia will get well again, God willing, and the Reds aren't troubling them. They killed our calf, but that's nothing. They've been merciful and won't harm our folk. They took a lot of grain, but you can't have war without losses. Perhaps we could get them across now." "I don't think so. And where could we take Natalia to, sick as she is? It would be too risky. They're all right there. The old woman's looking after everything, and I'm not so anxious now as I was. But there were fires in the village." "Who started them?" "The square's been burned out, and all the big merchants' houses. Korshunov's place was burned to the ground. Lukinichna got away, but old Grishaka remained behind to look after the farm. Your mother said he told her, 'I'll never leave my yard, and the Antichrists won't come near me. They're afraid of the sign of the cross.' You know he'd begun to go a little soft. But the Reds weren't afraid of his cross. The hut and the farm buildings were all burned down, and there's not a word of what happened to Grishaka. But it was time for him to die. He'd handed his farm over to his son 20 years back, and still went on living. It's your friend who's burning up the village. Curse him." "Whom do you mean?" "Mishka Koshevoy, God damn him." "It can't be him." "It's him, all right, God's truth. He visited our hut and asked after you. He told your mother that when the Reds crossed to the other side, her Grigor would be the first for the rope. He'll be hanging on the highest oak. I won't soil my sword with him, he said. He asked after me, too. If I catch old Panteleimon, he said, I won't kill him off at once, but I'll lay on the whip till his soul can get out through the cuts. That's the devil he's turned out to be. He goes through the village setting fire to the merchants' and priests' houses and saying, in revenge for Ivan Alexeyevich and Stockman, I'll burn down all Vishenska district. For another half hour, Grigor remained talking with his father, then went to his horse. The old man had made no further reference to Aksinya, but even so, Grigor was oppressed. Everybody must have heard, since father knows, he thought. Who told them? Who else except Prokhor has seen us together? Surely Stepan doesn't know, too. He ground his teeth in his shame and annoyance with himself. He treated Kristonia and his other fellow villagers to tobacco and talked with them for a few minutes. Just as he was about to mount his horse, he saw Stepan Astachov coming up. Stepan approached unhurriedly and exchanged greetings, but did not give him his hand. Grigor stared at him anxiously and inquisitively. Does he know? He wondered. But Stepan's handsome face was untroubled and even cheerful, and Grigor sighed with relief. Chapter 5. Grigor spent the next 2 days visiting the section of the front held by his 1st Division. He returned to find that the General Staff Command had transferred its headquarters to the village of Chorny, some way off from Vyashenska, and after resting his horse he rode to the village. Kudinov greeted him gaily, staring at him with a challenging smile on his lips. "Well, Grigor Pantelyevich, what have you seen?" he asked. "Tell us the news." "I've seen Cossacks and I've seen the Reds across the river," Grigor replied. "You've seen a good deal. We've had 3 aeroplanes here bringing cartridges and letters." "And what did your friend General Sidorin write?" Grigor inquired. "My cousin, you mean?" Kudinov continued the conversation in the same bantering tone. "He asks us to hold on with all our strength and not let the Reds cross. And he writes that the Don Army is about to start a decisive offensive." "He writes fair words," Grigor sneered. Kudinov suddenly turned serious. "They're going to break through. I'm telling only you, and that in the strictest secrecy. Within a week they'll have broken through the Red Army front. We must hold on." "We are holding on." "The Reds are preparing to cross the river at Gromok. They're still hammering away there. But where have you been? You haven't been lying low in Vyashenska all this time, have you? The day before yesterday I was searching all through the place for you, and one of my messengers came back and said you weren't in your quarters, but that a handsome woman had come out with tears in her eyes and said you'd ridden off. I couldn't help wondering whether you'd been amusing yourself with a girl and were hiding from us." Grigor frowned. He did not take kindly to Kudinov's little joke. "You should listen less to lies and should choose messengers with shorter tongues," he replied curtly. "If you send men with tongues too long for them, I'll shorten them with my sword." Kudinov burst into a roar of laughter and clapped Grigor on the back. "Can't you stand a joke?" he demanded. "But I've got more serious business to talk over with you. We want to send a couple of cavalry squadrons across the river somewhere this side of Kazanska to make an attack on the Reds. Perhaps they could even cross at Gromok and put them in a panic. What do you think?" After a moment's silence, Grigor replied, "It's not a bad idea." "And would you lead the squadrons yourself?" Kudinov asked. "Why me? We want a fighting commander for the job, that's why. We want someone with plenty of spirit, for it's no joke of a task. The crossing could be so badly bungled that not a man would return." Flattered by Kudinov's words, without further thought, Grigor agreed to take command. "I'll go, of course," he replied. "These are the lines we've been planning and thinking along." Kudinov spoke animatedly, rising from his stool and striding up and down the creaking floorboards of the room. "It won't be necessary for the force to go far to the rear of the enemy, but they should ride along the Don and shake them up a bit in 2 or 3 villages so that they feel sick. Win some cartridges and shells, capture some prisoners, and then return by the same road. It would all have to be done at night so as to be back at the fording place by dawn. Don't you think so? Well, think it over, and tomorrow choose the Cossacks you want to take and set off. We agreed that, except for you, there's no one here to do the job. And if you succeed, the Don Army won't forget it. As soon as we unite with our friends, I shall write a report to General Sidorin himself. I'll set out all your services, and you'll be raised in rank." He suddenly broke off as he noticed Grigor's face, hitherto calm, turn dark and distorted with rage. "I'll show you." Grigor swiftly folded his arms behind his back and rose from his stool. "You think I'd go for the sake of rank? You think you can hire me, promising me a higher position? Wait a bit. I spit on your rank. Wait, you've got me all wrong. I've got you all right." Grigor choked and sat down again on the stool. "You find somebody else. I'm not going to lead any Cossacks across the Don." You're all worked up over nothing. I won't take the command. There's nothing more to be said. Well, I'm not going to force you, or to plead with you. If you want to, you can. If you don't, it's as you wish. Our situation at the moment is very serious, and that's why we decided not to let them go on with their preparations for crossing if we could help it. I was joking about the rise in rank. You never can take a joke. I was joking about the women, and you flared up just the same. I know you're half a Bolshevik and don't like the officers, and you took it all so seriously. I was only teasing you just to see you flare up. Kudinov laughed so naturally that for a moment Grigor was troubled by the thought that perhaps after all he had been joking. All the same, I refuse to undertake the command, he said obstinately. I've changed my mind. Kudinov played unconcernedly with the end of his belt. After a long silence he remarked, Well, whether you've changed your mind or whether you're frightened, it doesn't matter. What does matter is that you're spoiling our plans. But of course we shall find someone else to send. Judge for yourself how serious our position is. Kondrat Medvedev has sent me a new proclamation today. He's directing their army against us himself. He's at Boguchar at present, and will be on us today or tomorrow. Here, read it for yourself, or you won't believe me. He pulled a yellowing sheet of paper with brown stains of blood on it out of his field wallet and handed it to Grigor. They found it on some commissar, a Latvian. The serpent resisted to the last cartridge, and then threw himself with fixed bayonet on an entire troop of Cossacks. Kondrat himself sent the man down. They've got brave men among them, too, with their ideas. They found this circular instruction on him. Grigor took the yellowing sheet and read, To be read out before all companies, squadrons, batteries, and commands. The end of the shameful Don revolt. The last hour has struck. All the necessary preparations have been made. Sufficient forces have been concentrated to shatter the traitors. The hour has struck for settlement of accounts with the Canes, who for over 2 months have been striking in the backs of our active armies on the southern front. With hatred and revulsion, all the workers and peasants of Russia have watched these Cossack bands, who, under a delusive red flag, are assisting the Black Hundred landowners, Denikin and Kolchak. Soldiers, commanders, commissars of the punitive expedition, the preparatory work is completed. Now, at the signal, forward. The nests of the dishonorable traitors and betrayers must be destroyed. The Canes must be exterminated. No mercy on those districts which offer resistance. Mercy only to those who voluntarily lay down their arms and come over to our side. Against the assistance of Kolchak and Denikin, lead, steel, and fire. Comrade soldiers, Soviet Russia relies on you. In a few days you must cleanse the Don from the black stain of treachery. The last hour has struck. All as one man forward. Chairman of the Republic Revolutionary Military Council, People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs, Boguchar, May 25th, 1919. Chapter 6. After delivering Stockmann's letter to the political section of the 14th Division, Mishka Koshevoy was attached to the 294th Taganrog Regiment, which, together with other detachments of the 33rd Kuban Division, had been flung into the Don province to suppress the Cossack revolt. Mishka took part in the struggle to capture Kargin and a number of villages lying along the river Chira. From the day he learned of Stockmann's murder and heard the rumor that Ivan Alexeyevich and the Yalanska communists had been killed, Mishka was possessed by a burning hatred for the Cossacks. He no longer thought, no longer listened to the voice of mercy in his heart when an insurgent Cossack fell into his hands. With blue eyes as cold as ice, he would demand of the prisoner, "Have you fought against the Soviet government?" and would ruthlessly cut the man down without waiting for an answer. Not only did he kill his prisoners, but he set the crimson cock of an incendiary torch under the eaves of the huts and villages abandoned by the insurgents. And when the fear-demented cows and bullocks broke down the fences and galloped bellowing into the street, he shot them down. He waged an irreconcilable, relentless war on the Cossack plenitude, on the Cossack perfidy, on all the inviolate and stagnant manner of life which had remained undisturbed for centuries under the roofs of the huts. Stockmann's and Ivan's deaths were as fuel to his hatred, and the words of the proclamation, "The nests of the dishonorable traitors must be destroyed, the canes must be exterminated," clearly formulated his blind feelings. The same day that the proclamation was read to his company, he and 3 other comrades burned down 150 huts in Kargin alone. He found some paraffin in a merchant's warehouse, and went round the square with a box of matches clutched in his hand. He left behind him a trail of pungent smoke and flame, enveloping the priests' and merchants' houses, and the huts of the richer Cossacks, the habitations of those whose slanders had driven on the ignorant Cossack masses to revolt. The cavalry was always the first to enter the deserted villages, and before the infantry arrived, Koshevoy had already fired the richest huts. He desired at all costs to get to Tatarsk to avenge on his fellow villagers the deaths of Ivan and the Alanska communists. He would burn down half the village. He had already mentally drawn up a list of those huts that must be burned down if he did reach Tatarsk, and if his regiment did not happen to pass that way, he was resolved to slip off at night without permission. Other motives besides his desire for revenge were responsible for his anxiety to visit Tatarsk again. During the past 2 years he had been seeing Dunya Melyakova whenever he was in the village, and they had developed still undeclared feelings of love for each other. Dunya had made him a tobacco pouch, and had given him a pair of goat's hair gloves, and he kept an embroidered handkerchief of hers jealously guarded in his breast pocket. Whenever he drew it out, he agitatedly recalled a hoar-frosted poplar standing by a well, a fine snow sprinkling from the somber sky, and Dunya's trembling lips and the crystal glitter of the snow lurking on her eyelashes. He made diligent preparations for his visit home. He took a colorful rug from the wall of a merchant's house in Kargin and fastened it under his horse-cloth. He found almost new striped trousers in a Cossack's chest, tore up 6 women's shawls for 3 changes of leg rags, and slipped a pair of woolen gloves into his pack to put on just before he rode down into Tatarsk. From time immemorial it had been the custom for a soldier returning home to be dressed in his finest, and Mishka, still enslaved by the Cossack tradition, devoutly made ready to observe the old custom. His horse was a fine dark sorrel which he had captured from a Cossack during an attack. His saddle was not too good. The leather was scratched and torn. The metal parts were rusty. The bit and snaffles were in a like state, and he had to do something to improve their looks. Fortunately, he had a happy inspiration. In one village, he found a nickel-plated iron bedstead standing outside a merchant's house, and on the 4 bedposts were polished metal knobs that brilliantly reflected the sun. It was an easy matter to remove them, and to fasten them by silken cords, 2 to the rings of the bit, and 2 to the bridle strap across the horse's forehead. The knobs gleamed like the white noonday sun on his horse's head, glittering so unbearably that the animal was dazzled and stumbled as it went. But although its sight suffered and its eyes watered, Mishka did not remove the knobs. The regiment marched along the Don bank toward Vishenska. So without much difficulty, Mishka obtained permission from his patrol commander to visit his people for the day. Not only did he obtain permission, but the officer asked him if he had a girl, and on Mishka saying he had, the man asked, "Have you got a watch and chain?" "No, comrade," Mishka answered. "That's bad," the commander remarked. He had been through the German war and knew what a disgrace it was to return to his native town without trophies. So he removed a watch and a massive chain from his own chest and handed them to Mishka, saying, "You're a good fighter. Here, wear these while you're at home, and dazzle the girl's eyes with them. I've been young myself, and I understand. Tell anyone who asks you that the chain is of new American gold." Mishka put on the watch and chain, shaved himself by the light of the campfire, saddled his horse, and rode off. At dawn he trotted into Tatarsk. The village seemed no different. The little belfry of the brick church still raised its tarnished gilt cross to heaven, the priests' and merchants' houses still surrounded the square, and the poplar still whispered the same language above the Koshevoy's tumble-down hut. Only the profound stillness which entangled the streets like a spider's web was striking by its abnormality. The shutters of the huts were fast closed. Here and there the doors were fastened with padlocks, but the majority were flung wide open. It was as though a pestilence had strode with heavy feet through the village, depopulating huts and streets, filling the habitations with emptiness and desolation. No sound was there of human voice, of a lowing cow, of a crowing cock. Only the sparrows chattered animatedly under the eaves of the sheds and on the brushwood. Mishka rode straight to his own hut. None of his family came out to meet him. The door leading into the porch was wide open, and by the threshold old leg rags, a bandage dark with blood, chickens' feathers and heads smothered with flies and already putrefying, were lying. Evidently some days previously Red Army men had eaten a meal in the hut. The shards of broken pots, chicken bones picked clean, fruit skins, and torn newspapers were scattered over the floor. Mishka passed into the front room. There everything was as in the old days, but he noticed that one half of the trap door leading to the cellar, where the watermelons were stored in autumn, seemed to have been lifted a little. He went across to the trap door. Surely Mother expected me. She may have hidden something in the cellar for me, he thought. Drawing his sword with its point, he raised the door. A smell of dampness and decay arose from the cellar. He went down on his knees and, peering into the darkness, at last discerned a half-bottle of vodka, a frying pan with fried eggs in it, a piece of bread half-eaten by mice, and a pot covered with a wooden mug, all standing on a spread tablecloth. So his old mother had been expecting him. She had prepared for him as for a welcome guest. His heart trembled with love and gladness as he lowered himself into the cellar. He found a canvas bag tied to a floor joist. He took it down and found in it his underlinen, old but beautifully mended, cleaned, and ironed. The mice had spoilt all the food, and only the milk and the vodka were left untouched. He drank the vodka, ate the solidified, ice-cold milk, took the linen, and clambered out. His mother had probably fled beyond the dawn. She was afraid to stay, and it was well she didn't, for the Cossacks would have killed her, he thought. As it is, I expect they ill-treated her because of me. He went out and untied his horse, but decided not to go straight to the Melyukovs' hut. It stood right above the dawn, and a good marksman might easily pick him off from across the river. He resolved to go to the Korshunovs' hut, and to return to the square at dusk, firing Mokhov's and the other merchants' and priests' houses under the cover of darkness. He rode along behind the yards to the Korshunovs' spacious yard, rode in through the gate, tied up his horse, and was about to enter the hut when old Grishaka came out on the steps. His white head was shaking, his faded eyes were screwed up blindly, his worn old Cossack tunic with the red spots on its greasy collar was carefully buttoned, but his trousers were falling down, and the old man had to hold them up with his hands. "How are you, Granddad?" Mishka called as he stood by the steps, waving his whip. The old man made no reply. Anger and dislike were mingled in his stern glance. "How are you?" Mishka raised his voice. "Praise be," Grishaka answered reluctantly. He continued to stare at Mishka with the same angry attention. "Why didn't you retreat across the Don, Daddy Grishaka?" Mishka asked. "Who are you?" the old man demanded. "Mishka Koshevoy, the one that used to work for us? That's right. But why didn't you go across the Don?" "I didn't want to, and I wouldn't. But what is that to you? Have you given yourself to the service of the Antichrists, wearing a red star on your cap? You son of a bitch! So you're fighting against our Cossacks, against your own fellow villagers." With uncertain tread he tottered down the steps. "I'm fighting against them," Mishka answered, "and if I see any of them, I'll show them." "Ah, what does the Holy Book say? With what measure ye measure, it shall be meted out unto you." "You needn't quote the sacred writings at me, old man. I haven't come here for that." "Get away from the hut at once," Mishka said harshly. "What for?" "Never mind what for. Get out, I tell you." "I won't leave my own hut. I know what you're going to do. You're the servant of the Antichrists. You've got their brand on your cap. As the Scriptures foretold, so has it come to pass. Son shall rise against father and brother against brother. Don't try to get me mixed up. There's no question of brothers here, but of simple arithmetic. My father worked for you to the very day of his death, and before the war I worked for you, strained my guts out laboring for you, and now the time's come to settle accounts. Clear out of the hut. I'm going to set it afire. You've lived all your life in a good house, but now you can live as we've had to live, in straw huts. Understand, old man?" "Yes, I understand. It's come to that, too. In the book of the prophet Isaiah it is written, 'Their slain shall be cast out, and their stink shall come up out of their carcasses, and the mountains shall be melted with their blood.'" "I haven't time to argue the Scriptures with you," Mishka said in a cold fury. "Will you clear out?" "No, you enemy." "It's through such as you that there's all this trouble and war going on. It's the likes of you who are troubling the people, raising them against the revolution," Mishka said as he hurriedly unslung his rifle. At the shot, Grishaka fell headlong, but as he lay, he muttered intelligibly, "Not my will, but thine be done. Lord, take thy slave." He groaned, and the blood spurted out between his white whiskers. "You ought to have gone long before this, you old devil," Mishka said as he fastidiously avoided the old man's body and ran up the steps. The dry leaves and twigs, carried into the porch by the wind, burst into a rosy flame. The board partitions separating the pantry from the porch quickly caught fire. The smoke rose to the roof and curled into the rooms. Koshevoy went out. By the time he had set fire to the shed and the granary, the flames in the hut had broken into the open, licking the pine boards of the window shutters, stretching their fingers up to the roof. Until dusk, Mishka slept in the neighboring orchard under the shade of thorn bushes. His hobbled horse grazed lazily close by. As evening drew on, the horse was troubled with thirst, and neighed and awoke its master. Mishka rose, watered the animal at the well in the orchard, saddled it, and rode into the street. The smoke was still rising from the charred implements in the Korshunov's yard. Only the high stone foundations and the half-ruined stove, raising a sooty chimney to the sky, were left of the hut. Mishka rode straight to the Melyakovs' yard. As he went through the wicket gate, he found Ilinichna heaping chips into an apron. "Hello, Auntie," he graciously called to her. In her terror at the sight of him, she could utter not a word in reply, but dropped her hands, letting the chips pour out of the apron. "How are you, Auntie?" Praise be, Ilinichna answered irresolutely. "Alive and well?" "Alive, but don't ask whether I'm well." "Where are your Cossacks?" he asked as he dismounted and went across to her. "The other side of the Don." "Waiting for the cadets to arrive?" "Mine's a woman's job. I know nothing about such things." "And is Dunya at home?" "She's gone across the Don, too." "They carried her there." Mishka's voice quivered with his anger. "I tell you, Auntie, your son Grigor's turned out to be the most bitter enemy of the Soviet government. When we get to the other side, his neck will be the first to feel the rope. But Panteleimon Prokofyevitch needn't have run away. He's old and lame. He should have stayed at home." "To wait for his death?" Ilinichna asked harshly, and began again to gather the chips into her apron. "Death's a long way off from him. We might have given him a taste of the lash, but we wouldn't have troubled to kill him. But I haven't come to talk about that." He adjusted the watch chain across his chest. "I've come to visit Dunya Pantelyevna. I'm awfully sorry she's gone across the Don, too. But I tell you as her mother, I've long been wanting her. But we haven't much time to be worried about girls just now. We're fighting the counter-revolution, and we shall finish it off without mercy. As soon as we've finished with it and the Soviet government is set up everywhere, then I shall be sending to you for the hand of your Dunya. This isn't the time to talk about such things. Yes, it is, Mishka scowled. It's not the time to get engaged, but we can talk about the matter. I can't pick and choose my time. Today I'm here, and tomorrow I may be sent across the Don. That's why I'm warning you. You're not to give Dunya's hand to anyone else, or it'll be the worse for you. If a letter comes from my regiment saying I've been killed, you can do what you like, but you can't now, because we love each other. I haven't brought her any presents, but if there's anything you'd like from any of the bourgeois merchants' houses, just say so, and I'll go at once and bring it here. God forbid! I've never touched other people's goods yet. Well, as you like. Give a deep bow for me to Dunya if you see her before me. And now goodbye, Auntie. Don't forget what I've said. Ilinichna went into the hut without replying, and Mishka mounted his horse and rode off to the square. He found it swarming with Red Army soldiers who had come down from the hills into the village for the night. Their animated voices sounded in the streets. 3 of them, going with a portable machine gun down to an outpost on the river, held up Mishka and examined his documents. Outside Semyon Chugun's hut he came across 4 more. 2 of them were wheeling oats in a wheelbarrow, and 2 more were helping Semyon's wife to carry a sewing machine and a sack of flour. The woman recognized Mishka and greeted him. "What's that you've got there?" Mishka asked. "We're taking these things across to this working woman's hut. We're giving her the bourgeois machine and the flour," one of the Red Army men boldly replied. Mishka set fire to 7 houses belonging to the merchant Mokho and other merchants, the priests, and 3 rich Cossacks, all of whom had fled beyond the Donets. Only then did he leave the village. He rode up the hill and turned his horse. Below him, in Tatarsk, the ruddy flames were rising with great tails of sparks against the black sky. The reflection of the conflagration flickered on the swift waters of the Don, and, driven by the wind, the flames sank and bent to the west, avidly consuming the buildings. A light breeze was blowing from the eastern steppes. It fanned the flames and carried fiery black particles through the air to settle far from the square.